What is going on to all my Cormac McCarthy fans out there? This is going to be a one-take video where I'm going to be riffing on thoughts surrounding Cormac McCarthy's death 1 year after. And I am hanging out here with my cat, Griselda. We are chilling, ready to talk about some Cormac McCarthy. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is, what of the multiple unfinished projects by McCarthy? Are those ever going to get published? Would you like to see those get published? Because there is allegedly 3 unfinished novels and 3 unfinished screenplays by McCarthy that have not been released to the public yet, or been published officially. And that's a huge number. 6 different projects. That's over half of his catalog. That would add another third to his catalog. And I'm a little bit iffy on this subject, but I think with the Cormac McCarthy archive and us being able to go there and read up to, like, in Outer Dark, his first draft of a novel, and usually at least the third draft onward of his novels and his screenplays and his grocery list and these things, if we can do all of that, why not be able to study some of his unfinished manuscripts? You know, another author we talk about on this channel a lot, Mr. David Foster Wallace. I don't have The Pale King over here, but his novel, The Pale King, which is an unfinished novel, is over there. But I don't necessarily, a lot of people talk crap about the novel, and it's unfinished. There are some weird aspects to it that don't make sense and need to be flushed out, but there is growth in there. There is potential, and it really does complete some of the elements of the McCarthy story in our head, because we care about story so much in literature. I want to know, why did David Foster Wallace kill himself? He went on this hiatus of over 10 years after he published Infinite Jest before he killed himself, and he didn't release another novel. And he was working on The Pale King, but experienced massive amounts of writer's block and actually imitated Cormac McCarthy's introduction to Suttree with one of his characters in The Pale King. But even more so than that, he featured in that novel a character that somewhat resembled himself and would speak in Cormac McCarthy vernacular. And it's also funny that McCarthy and Wallace met each other at the Santa Fe Institute. Wonder what the hell they talked about. But there's a character who speaks in McCarthy's vernacular and eventually breaks free from that. And it's actually laid out. He actually talks about it. And there are imitations in the David Foster Wallace archive, which is right next to the Cormac McCarthy archive. Like, I feel so lucky as a McCarthy and a Wallace scholar that I live here in Tucson, where they both lived, both wrote about, have a lot of information I can gather here and learn about them here. And then, a day's drive away, I can access both of their archives and go over there, even just for a weekend, take a Friday off of work and just boost up there and read some of the stuff. And so, yeah, I'm super excited to see, because with The Pale King, I felt like it was a complete work. I felt like it did close all the loops I had in my head about the end of Wallace's life. And Wallace, luckily, in a lot of his novels and short stories, he doesn't close loops. He doesn't close loops. He doesn't really believe in the story ending. And so I think, especially in his second novel, which was about the IRS and about boredom, that he wouldn't close all the loops. That's what's kind of the biggest contrast. If you do thriller elements in a not a very boring novel about the IRS, it's kind of genius. Anyway, returning to McCarthy, I would like to see those 6 projects released to the best of their ability. Maybe some officially, maybe some unofficially in the archive for people to see if they are really rough cuts or something. But just to see what he was working on, because there's this big question mark about what the hell McCarthy was doing during the last, we could say, 28 years of his life. Because in the mid-1990s, he finishes The Crossing. And he already had 80% of Cities of the Plain written from the 1970s, and also had No Country for Old Men written as in a screenplay form from the 1970s. And so it's, funny to think about that after Cities of the Plain, Outside of the Road, which took him only a couple weeks to write, allegedly, he didn't do too much original writing. And so what was he originally working, like, what was some of that original content he was working on? We saw it in The Road, and that was a beautiful display. And also in Stella Maris, which allegedly he was still working on in 2013. In 2013, he submitted The Passenger to his editor and was like, hey, check this out. Let's start working on this a little bit, editing it. And apparently there were little to no edits in it. But I have this other novel and I want to do a double release. And the publisher was like, let's do a double release if they're about the same thing, because God knows how long it's going to take until you get there. And so they did the double release, which was super cool. But Stella Maris is a little bit more fresh, and I think that's why he kind of fell back on the classic screenplay and dialogue style, because we did get The Sunset Limited and The Counselor and some other original pieces by McCarthy, but they were in the screenwriting realm, which he somewhat struggled with because, I mean, first of all, they weren't necessarily the most director-friendly or movie outside of No Country for Old Men. But, The Sunset Limited is a dialogue between two guys, and HBO did what they could with it, and it was great, honestly. Just not box office thriller or entertaining to more than a somewhat niche audience. And the same could be said about The Counselor, even though it featured big names, Brad Pitt, I forget some of their other names, those dumb actors and actresses. But after, looking at that, even though I really liked the screenplay and thought the movie was decent, was just a little bit off. Something felt off there. I don't know if it was Ridley Scott or whatever his name is with the directing. I don't think movies like that were necessarily his forte. If I got that wrong, please comment down below who actually directed it. But I also love the idea of where McCarthy sat and wrote made a difference, because before he moved to the Santa Fe Institute, he was writing at his home, being, kind of a typical writer. But in 1998, he moves to the Santa Fe Institute. And what does he do? He starts writing in public, everyone. He told a story in that Krakauer interview, where he says a kid walks into the library and asks him, what is that, referring to his typewriter? Is that a productive work environment? Is going out and talking to your buddies about science at lunch really a place where a lot of writing gets done? And judging, like I said, from what he got done, which was adapting No Country for Old Men and writing The Road in a couple weeks and concluding Stella Maris and The Passenger, which had been a project that spanned over 60 years, it wasn't the most productive time in his life. And I understand that in that type of environment, that wasn't possible. And so is there nonfiction? Is there unreleased papers like the Kukule problem that McCarthy wrote? These are some of the questions in my mind as we kind of move beyond the immediacy of his death. Also kind of want to meander over this idea of immortality projects. When you look at Freud's protege, Otto Rank, right over here in the book, I have to move a little bit more. Sorry, Griselda, my cat. Art and artist, creative personality, the creative urge and personality development. When Rank was Freud's protege, his secretary, his favorite student who he thought was going to do big things, and he did. But eventually he broke with Freud, much like Alder, Reich, and Jung, because Freud, with the Psychoanalytical Society, was very constrained, and you could only publish in kind of the scope of Freud and not break some of the axiomatic theories. And Rank took a much more mythic angle to analyzing people with neurosis and these problems, because he studied the artist, the warrior, a lot of these kind of archetypes, but from a mythological angle. And so did Carl Jung, but they kind of came up with different conclusions. But Rank believed in this idea of the denial of death, doing immortality projects like art, or creating fantasies in the brain to avoid reality. And he kind of pinned that on the artist and talked about that's why so many different artists are screwed up, is because, sorry, I'm switching the cat on my legs, because they are constantly on this wheel of art to heal their trauma or their neurosis. But what happens when they stop? When you look at Ernest Hemingway, for instance, he talks about in like Big Two-Hearted River, the trout, the flow of the stream, the overcoming of PTSD that he suffered when he was younger. In the Nick Adams stories in Hemingway, you kind of get a lot of this. And, with Hemingway, he was a long-handed writer. He did a lot of writing long-handed. But when near the end of his life, he received electroshock therapy, one of the things that happened was that he lost the ability to write. He wasn't writing during those last months of his life, which is a pretty scary thought to think about because, okay, with Ronk's theory, this artistic flow ends. And to go deeper on this, let's talk about Otto Ronk really fast. Let me give you the rundown of some trauma theory. When you look at Kathy Caruth and the not the Yale School of Trauma, but in certain aspects of literary theory and science and things at Yale, there was a school of thought that my professor referred to as the Yale School of Trauma. I don't know if that's its official name, but people like Kathy Caruth and others really broke ground with things like PTSD, because with postmodernism and kind of the opening of ideas in the space of the university, what did we do with all these soldiers that just got back? In the late 1960s and 70s and early 80s, there was this kind of explosion in trauma theory because they started looking back at a lot of Freud's proteges like Otto Ronk, which was their main inspiration. And much like Ernest Becker in his book, The Denial of Death, which I think I actually have. Do I have that? Yeah, it's right here, actually. Everyone should go and read this book, the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death. And Ernest Becker takes Ronk's ideas and makes them more digestible and applicable to our daily reality, but still combines a lot of the mythic, psychological, and intellectual elements that make Ronk so great, because Ronk is writing, obviously, in translated works for us Americans, but in a much more scientific and highfalutin style. But Becker kind of, refines the ideas in a beautiful way. And this was widely inspirational. If I look at the year that The Denial of Death was published, if I'm just getting my facts right, 1973. And then the Yale School of Trauma, let's look them up. Let's see if they exist. Is that a real thing? I guess not. Anyway, we could type in Kathy Caruth right here. If you're here with me, let's go. Yeah, trauma. Anyway. So, man, I'm getting lost in the weeds here. Hemingway. Okay, trauma theory. There we go. When you are injured, let's say you are in a car crash or you experience something traumatic, a psychic trauma, like someone abusing you or some sexual abuse or manipulation or something of that manner, a certain part of the body and the soul locks. And as a yoga teacher for the past 12 years, I know this is true, that when you unlock through flexibility, passive flexibility, active mobility, and calisthenic strength, pulling, pushing, contralateral, whatever we want to call it. When you master some of those elements and start to open your body in that manner, a lot of the time there is a limitation, a psychic limitation holding some body part back. For instance, the hips are very much tied to emotion. If you can put your foot behind your head, you have to be somewhat in tune with your emotions to be able to let that happen and kind of get over some of the base consciousness urges. And so you can unlock trauma, and the trauma, for instance, there is a trauma of hip pain because all throughout history, we would squat and do things with our hips, but there has been a massive explosion in adults and in teenagers with ACL and knee injuries because most people don't just have external hip mobility, which if you watch me like right now, this is how I'm sitting. Like I sit on this, there's my cat. I sit on a pad. I don't have a chair behind me. I sit in half lotus, full lotus, whatever other position all the time to keep my spine straight, but to work on my hip mobility, because a lot of people have lost that. They don't even have the ability to do a half lotus without their leg like going high in the sky or hurting themselves. And that's super bad. I mean, that's terrible. And all throughout history, that was a very rare thing until very recently. And so obviously with the addition of hyper-rationality and intellectualism and all the overthinking and self-consciousness that we possess, that creates a very rigid feeling in the body. And so all these different body parts, because we're forced to sit in these little positions, we sit in cubicles or chairs or looking forward at our phones all the time, our body starts to shrink and we don't perform movement variability in our personal life. And it ends up becoming a fucking disaster. And so I understand that there is a body connection. If maybe you've experienced something similar, let me know. But then there's a psychic connection. There's this weird energetic thing that happens. And this is the core of trauma. Like, where is trauma located in the body? Well, it's really hard to define that, but there seems to be these psychic centers that can be released or added to. And, how to do that is, a whole other thing. But they seem to be frozen. That I've known people who were injured in a car crash and they had trauma locked in their body for decades until they discovered meditation and yoga and starting to get over their trauma. And even more so with people who have a history of sexual abuse or these things. They have body trauma a lot of the time, and that's locked up, but they also have this psychic trauma. And so how do you get that going? Well, just to use, not to be too reductive here, but there is locked trauma and then there's flowing trauma. How can you get trauma to flow? Well, one of my professors, Lee Barnes, who wrote about, he was a combat veteran from Vietnam, wrote some pretty good novels about Vegas. He once told me that when he finally sat down to write his memoir, so he went to Vietnam, then he came back and he got an MFA, and then he was working as a poker dealer in casinos in Las Vegas, and he was a cop, and then he was a professor, and he worked out every single day, and he led this super active lifestyle. But he eventually realized that was all to move away from the trauma that he experienced during Vietnam, because when he finally sat down, so he got a sabbatical from his professor job, and took 9 months off or 8 months off or something, the summer and spring semester. And so as he's sitting there, he's writing this memoir. He took it off to write this memoir, When We Walked Through the Clouds. I would recommend it if you like Vietnam stuff. He takes a different take, because when you see guys like Tim O'Brien and others, a lot of the time they take more of a kind of ecstatic or expressive view of Vietnam, or romanticization, I guess you should say. But even though there is combat and death in his memoir, a lot of it's really just about base camp and like what it was like. Anyway, but when he sat down to write this novel, he was in his 70s or something. Like, he was older, this memoir, excuse me. But in that stillness, because of his old age and some other, single man, his old age, can't exercise as much, and he has no work, no job, he started to experience massive levels of PTSD for the first time in his life, and had to go see a therapist for the first time in his life. And yeah, there's some beautiful lines about this that I'll share another time about him. But that's what, really resonated with me in terms of this kind of locked versus flow environment in terms of a writer, is that when he finally stopped flowing super hard, even though he was writing a little bit, the trauma started to come back. And so a lot of authors do drugs. They do the flow of, of liquor going down the body, the flow, the inhale of smoke, these repetitive actions and mindsets, and disassociate, and have all these kind of psychological triggers and problems that they're using to just move away from this trauma, because it can be immense for anyone who has had any type of trauma out there. If you actually try to get over it, it's not an easy task. And I've experienced nothing of an insane caliber. So kind of the small wins that I've had have been way harder than I've been able to realize. And so what is, McCarthy's trauma? What fueled this journey? Like, taking it back to McCarthy here, everybody. What fueled his journey to want to write these things? And Becker talks about these immortality projects, that authors create this body of work to become immortal, that depressives create this fantasy in their head to create their own little zone, their own little fantasy. Same thing with addicts and neurotic people, their own little world. And I think that really speaks to McCarthy's reluctance to speak out about his personal life and many other things, because maybe he understood that this trauma had something, and that by getting over it or doing things like that, he was going to lose that edge, that drive. Because McCarthy said, I became a writer because I knew I could be the best at it, and I would never do anything I couldn't be the best at. There is kind of that competitive kind of like that itch within him. And I respect that. I love that. And that's how you get to the heights. You're not going to get anywhere in writing unless you do have a bit of an ego and a bit of a hardcore motivational personal development push. McCarthy stayed optimistic during all these terrible times. I know most people I know, would crack under the pressure of being almost homeless, having no money, having the wife nag at you. Go get a job. Go write something a little bit that will sell a little bit more. Most people can't handle that. They can handle 5% of that. McCarthy withstood that pain of his family, of his first wife, of his second wife. He stayed true to the craft. And look at him now. There is a booktuber named Ian talking about him, now talking in the third person and going full meta with the video. That's fucking awesome. And so the trauma, I think from his parents, from being, born as a Southerner, things of that nature. And I totally understand that. But I also think that a lot of McCarthy's deep trauma is specifically from his father. And I've talked about this before, but his mother seemingly was strong and a good mother, but his father created a lot of problems in his life. So, to commemorate McCarthy, he is one of my favorite writers, if not my favorite writer, probably my favorite writer of all time. I love him dearly. I commend his work. I commend all you guys out there for continuing to read him, for spreading his work to other people. And I hope for another good year of McCarthy studies, McCarthy scholarship. There was a great book that came out this year by Marcus Viersum named American Apocalypse that is I think, a great addition to the McCarthy studies world. I'm going to have him on the show very soon. There's been a couple others that I'll talk about soon. And hopefully next will be you. Hopefully we can continue to grow this community, whether it is through videos or journal articles about Cormac, or probably more relevantly, your own writing that's inspired by Cormac. You can be the next Southern Gothic OG or the Western or whatever. I believe in you. I love you. And I'll see you guys in the next video, which will be dropping very soon. Peace. And we are now clicking off the one take video.